You may be wondering, if I have $1 million saved at 62, can I retire today? Well, I've worked with many folks over the years that were facing this exact question. And while $1 million is certainly a big milestone, the real question here isn't just how much you have saved, it's how much you want to spend and how you'll cover healthcare and how your plan's going to hold up if markets don't cooperate. And so today I'm going to walk you through two examples that are both based upon real situations with people that I've worked with over the course of the last year. Both are right around retirement age, both have right about $1 million saved, but they have very different lifestyles and they have very different outcomes. Let me also say this up front. No matter whether you have, let's say, $500,000 saved, or if you have $1 million, or if you have $2 million, and no matter whether you're single or married, the principles that I'm going to talk about here today are all the same. If you need $3,500 a month, or $7,000 a month, or even $14,000 a month in retirement, certainly the math shifts, but the strategies are still going to apply. One caveat I should mention, of course, is that at higher spending levels, taxes are going to take a bigger bite, especially if most of your savings are in pre-tax accounts. And that's why the gross numbers that I use here are just estimates. And they will definitely look different depending upon how much you have in, a Roth account versus pre-tax accounts versus, taxable accounts, and what the basis is and things like that. If we really want to get, into the details and get specific there. We'll keep some of this kind of just big picture. What I want to do here first is walk through the first case study. So this is Dana. She was 62 when we started working together, single, had $1 million saved. She wanted to retire immediately, but she still had a small mortgage, and she was targeting about $7,000 a month after taxes for lifestyle expenses and travel and things like that. She really wanted to do some traveling while she was healthy, so that was definitely something that was important to her. Since she wanted to spend $7,000 a month, that meant that she needed closer to $8,000 to $8,300 a month gross from her portfolio, and also from Social Security combined. She didn't have any other guaranteed income sources like a pension or anything else. So it's just going to be Social Security and also the portfolio withdrawals. And her plan looked doable, but we had to plan around a couple of big factors. One of them being healthcare before Medicare at age 65. And so, keep in mind the premiums and out-of-pocket costs could easily run $12,000 to $15,000 per year, maybe more. Just all depends upon the plan that you select. But with careful planning, it could be much less than that. If she qualified for the ACA subsidies, and that, of course, would depend on how we manage her taxable income. And this is why we plan withdrawals strategically, pulling from different accounts, depending upon how those different accounts are taxed. And then once Medicare kicks in at age 65, healthcare expenses often drop. They could go down to perhaps $3,000 to $7,000 a year, all depending upon the coverage choices that you selected, whether it's supplement, an advantage plan, things like that would all factor into that. Another factor here is that she was going to have a high withdrawal rate in the early years of retirement. Now, if the markets fell and she's withdrawing nearly 10% of her portfolio, that could certainly be dangerous. That's called sequence of returns risk, when you have a bad market early in retirement. And if you do have that early in retirement, that can do far more damage than the same drop later on. I've seen plans that they look fine on paper, but they got cut short simply because the first year or two was a down market. So it's definitely something that needs to be planned for. So here's how we structured Dana's plan. So from 62 to 64, she went ahead and took on a part-time job doing consulting. And by doing that, this was going to greatly reduce the amount that she was going to need to withdraw from her portfolio. And we also used a blended withdrawal strategy to get the additional income that she was going to need on top to live on. And we did this blended withdrawal strategy because we really wanted to try to manage the ACA premiums, to try to keep that income down in order to qualify for more ACA credits. Here's another key lever as a part of her plan was Social Security timing. For Dana, her projected benefit at age 67 was about $3,200 a month. which was roughly $38,000 a year. And, she could potentially increase her benefit even further, of course. She could wait until age 70. But for her and her situation, that probably wasn't going to make sense. Now, we can always reevaluate down the road. We still have some time, certainly, until then. But that's kind of the plan, kind of, going in for now. What we did here is we built in some flexibility. If the markets were strong, she could continue to delay her Social Security benefit. But if markets stumbled, she had the option then where we could go ahead and start taking her Social Security benefits, or she could start taking them at age 64 with about $2,700 a month, which is roughly $32,000 a year. And so if she did this would then reduce the pressure on her portfolio at that, riskiest time when, again, going back to sequence risk, she had to pull out substantial sums of money when the markets were going down. And, this is also where my guardrails framework, comes in. Instead of locking her spending, at a flat $7,000 a month, no matter what we do is we monitor this over time. So if markets are strong, she can just keep her lifestyle and maybe even get a raise if her portfolio hits the upper band. And then on the flip side here, if markets were to weaken, that would trigger a signal, and then we could temporarily trim that back. Both of these are built-in adjustments, the guardrails, and it's designed to help protect her plan without having that constant worry as far as, how much can I actually spend here in retirement? What makes sense? What's doable? Now, having that flexibility, adjusting the Social Security timing and strategically drawing from the different accounts that she has, and also using this overall guardrails framework for her overall spending needs, this is what gave Dana the confidence to decide to fully retire once she gets to 64. Michael, on the other hand, he's the other one I want to talk about here. He had actually just turned 63, so he was a year older, and he had a little over $1 million saved, so just a little bit more than Dana had. And unlike Dana, though, he had no mortgage, and he was aiming for a comfortable but more modest lifestyle than her. And so for him, he only wanted to have about $5,500 to $5,800 a month, somewhere in that range, after taxes. What mattered most to him really was just more stability. He was a pretty easygoing guy. He said, if I just have some more time with the grandkids and, get to go down to the club, he calls it, little golf club. He just does some pitch and putt type of golf and things like that. So pretty simple. He says, I'm good. That's where I go back to everyone's lifestyle in retirement is different. Everyone desires something different. And so, for him, that meant, him wanting to spend $5,500 to $5,800, net after tax means that he would have to have about $6,600 a month gross, or about $80,000 a year coming from all sources. And his projected Social Security benefit at age 67 was about $2,900 a month, which is roughly $35,000 a year. And so, eventually, close to half of his gross income need would be covered by Social Security, assuming that he did delay and take it at age 67. Now, in the short term, what we were going to do here is kind of structure some bridge years, so to speak. So this is before Social Security starts. So Michael, the plan was for him to withdraw about $6,600 a month from his portfolio. So roughly 8% of his balance annually. And that's pretty high, but it's only for a temporary period of time. And really that's quite high. If that was going to be the withdrawal rate, let's say for 30 years, all adjusted for inflation, that's certainly on the high side. No doubt about it. But we're only doing this for a short period of time. It's just those 4 years to help bridge the gap up until when he would start to take his Social Security. For him, here's how we structured it. So a portion of his portfolio was invested conservatively as a short-term bucket. So again, this is to cover those 4 bridge years, and the rest of his money was invested for growth. So that way, when the markets dipped, he wasn't forced to sell his long-term investments at a loss. Now, once Social Security begins at 67, it provides about $2,900 a month guaranteed, which would reduce his portfolio withdrawals to about $3,700 a month, which would put him closer in the range of about 4.5% to 5% withdrawal rate of his annual account balance. And this type of withdrawal rate, 4.5% to 5%, is much more sustainable than that 8%. And in fact, typically at that type of withdrawal rate over time, what I typically see is the same I saw with this one, is that it's very likely that he would be able to increase his spending over time, even beyond inflation adjustments if he wanted to. It was very likely that he would be able to increase that as well, get pay increases if the markets were to increase. Now, some things to consider here for married couples. I mentioned at the beginning, everything that I'm talking about here today applies whether you're single or married, but there's a couple other caveats I should mention for married couples. You've got 2 Social Security checks we're likely talking about now. And so, of course, that means, higher guaranteed income earlier on. Another thing to factor in here is that later on, when one spouse passes away, one check goes away, right? The smaller check goes away, the larger one stays. But we do need to make sure that we're planning for that survivor income. So that the check goes away, you're also filing as a single person as well. So that also affects you from a tax standpoint. And also, healthcare timing and costs can look very different as spouses retire at different ages. Now, let's talk a little bit about the 4% rule and also the retirement spending smile. You may have heard of the 4% rule, and I often say I believe the 4% rule leads to underspending in retirement. It's a very conservative estimate. The idea being that you could spend 4% of your portfolio the first year of retirement and then increase that for the rate of inflation. Well, even Bill Bengen, who's the researcher that had created this 4% rule, he recently said that 4.7% is more realistic. So I think that's good, because otherwise I think people are just, too many people I see just, starting to underspend. People get into their 80s, start realizing I'm never going to spend all this. But, here's the bigger point that I want to make. Most retirees don't spend in a straight line. Most follow the retirement spending smile, which is, the higher spending in the early go-go years, right? You retire and now you have all this time. You're the healthiest, youngest that you'll ever be going forward. And now you want to get out there and do things, right? Whether it's travel or just go out spending money, whatever it is, whatever hobbies or activities you like to do. And then this kind of tapers down over the years. You get into the slow go years and then the no go years, and kind of, often when you get into those later years of retirement, you might see a spike in healthcare costs. And so that's kind of the retirement spending smile. And, this is just one reason why flexibility works best. The key here is being able to adjust your spending needs when it makes sense, and really understanding, what your core spending needs are. What do you really need to spend each month just to, pay the mortgage, pay the rent, whatever it is, put food on the table, those types of things that are just, you've got to do. And what are the things that are discretionary? What could you actually pull back on if you needed to? And this helps dictate kind of what your initial withdrawal rate would be. I use a Guardrails framework with this, where over time, if the portfolio, the markets are doing well, you can get pay increases, or the portfolio markets are not doing well, you may need to take a pay cut, and understanding kind of how that works and what the parameters are around that. Don't want to go into a lot more detail on that. I do want to mention one other key factor here I think is important when we're thinking about this, is that your health and your longevity matter, in these discussions. If we're talking about somebody retiring at 55, they might need their money to last for 40 years. Which then could call for a more conservative withdrawal rate over time, especially if that 55-year-old is in good health. Where somebody retiring at 70 may only need maybe 20 years, maybe 25 years, maybe less, right? Depending upon what your health looks like at that point. And then, of course, if you don't need the income to last as long, that can support a higher safe withdrawal rate. So those are some important factors also to consider. Another thing is inflation. So, I mean, we've got a plan for that. As an example, at 3% inflation, $6,000 a month today would cost over $10,000 a month 20 years from now. Now, Do keep in mind again, I talked about the retirement spending smile. If you need 6,000 today, you may not need 10,000 in 20 years. You may need less than this, but nevertheless, we still need to factor in inflation based upon the anticipated expenses. For couples, we always plan for the survivor, as I was saying. When one spouse passes away, one social security check goes away, right? Most of the expenses likely will still remain. Some obviously won't. Maybe you sell one car, these types of things. But certainly, again, for married couples, most all this applies, just a couple little nuances here and there. All right, so let's go over some key lessons here. First of all, there's no simple yes or no answer to can I retire at 62 with $1 million. There's several factors at play, including, of course, how much do you want to spend? What type of lifestyle do you want to have in retirement? Does your retirement look more like Dana's, or does it look more like Michael's, or maybe something in between? What kind of lifestyle do you really want to have? And then, of course, timing matters. For both Dana and Michael, they had to bridge healthcare up until Medicare at age 65. And since they each wanted to delay Social Security, we built strategies in order to cover those early years without putting their long-term plans at risk. Michael really wanted to delay until 67, willing to create more of a bucket strategy, for that short-term, income over those 4 years that he needed to cover. Dana, a little bit different. She really wanted to be more aggressive. I didn't get into that a lot here, but she wanted to be more aggressive. And so that was kind of the plan. It was like, if the markets were to go down, or portfolio were to go down, we're going to go ahead and turn on Social Security to help reduce that sequence of returns risk. So different approaches, different ways to do this. Another thing to consider, of course, is that the markets matter. Having a bad year early on, plus having high withdrawals, that's a double hit. So you got to plan around that and make sure that you plan accordingly. Also, spending patterns matter. Real life follows more, I believe, that spending smile. That's what I've seen over the years with clients that I've worked with and people that I talk to and everywhere else. The older people get, I find in retirement, people just tend to want to spend less. Even when I try to get them to spend more, they're fine. And I find this to be the case more often than not. Another thing here is that flexibility matters. Guardrails on spending, and also being willing to adjust Social Security timing, like in the case of these individuals, and choosing withdrawal sources strategically can certainly make a difference. Certainly for these folks in those early years, it was kind of making sure that they could qualify for the ACA credits. So, deciding how much to withdraw and from which accounts to do that, but also factoring in how those choices on the withdrawals were going to impact their future income, their future lifetime tax bill. What would it do to their RMDs in the future, right? Things like that. Of course, taxes matter. Most retirees have money in pre-tax accounts, which means that, part of every withdrawal goes to the IRS. It's not what you make. It's all about what you keep. How much do you actually get to spend at the end of the day? So can you retire at 62 with $1 million? Well, of course, the simple answer here is that it depends, right? For some folks, absolutely. For others, maybe not. Maybe need to continue to work another year or something like that. There's a lot of different factors at play, and we covered a lot of that here today. Now, if you're wondering about your own situation, whether now is the right time for you to retire, or how much can you safely spend throughout retirement, that's exactly what I help people figure out. And so I've added a link below in the description. You can click on that, learn more about the process that I take and how I help people with that. I do want to leave you with this. If you're 62 years old and you have about $1 million saved, think about, do your numbers look more like Dana's? Wanting to spend more in retirement, do more things, maybe some more travel, things like that? Or is it more like Michael's, looking for more of a simple life, not wanting to spend as much, that sort of thing? I will tell you this, that your answer to that question will tell you a lot about your readiness to retire. Take care. I'll see you soon.